Today, North Korea is a country where even owning the wrong television can become a crime.
The imperialist aggressors across the border are preparing for war. Our forces stand ready to defend the homeland.
But North Korea did not begin as North Korea. Its story goes back more than 2,000 years. Long before modern borders existed, ancient Korean kingdoms were already rising across the peninsula. One of the most powerful was Goryeo, a kingdom that controlled much of northern Korea and parts of Manchuria.
The map illustrates the precarious position of Goryeo. As neighboring territories encroached, the threat of all-out war became a stark reality.
Its warriors fought powerful neighbors, defended huge fortresses, and built a reputation for military strength. But Goryeo was not alone. Three major kingdoms competed for control of Korea. Goryeo controlled the north. Beach dominated the southwest. And Silla controlled the southeast. For centuries, these kingdoms fought, formed alliances, betrayed each other, and fought again. Imagine three powerful neighbors fighting over the same house for hundreds of years. Eventually, Silla joined forces with Tang China and defeated its major Korean rivals. By the late 7th century, much of the Korean peninsula had been brought under Silla's control. But Korean history was nowhere near finished. New kingdoms would rise, and old ones would disappear. One of those kingdoms was Goryeo, a dynasty that would eventually give Korea its familiar name. Goryeo developed a powerful royal government, controlled large territories, and became an important medieval Korean state. Then came Joseon, a dynasty that would rule Korea for roughly 5 centuries. Joseon society was deeply influenced by Confucian ideas, education, government service, and strict social hierarchy. Scholar officials became extremely important, and learning could determine a person's position in society. But after centuries of kingdoms and dynasties, Korea was about to face a completely different kind of threat.
Japan was expanding its power, and in 1910, Korea was formally annexed by the Japanese Empire. Japanese rule transformed Korea's government, economy, education, and daily life.
But Korean resistance never completely disappeared. Then, in 1945, Japan lost World War II. Korea was suddenly liberated. After decades of colonial rule, the country was finally free. But freedom came with an unexpected problem. The Americans and Soviets had to decide who would occupy Korea. So they drew a line across the peninsula. That line was the 38th parallel. It was supposed to be temporary. Just a military boundary during the occupation. But the Soviet Union occupied the north, while American forces occupied the south. And quickly, the temporary line began turning into something much more permanent. The Soviet Union supported a communist government in the north. The United States supported a different political system in the south. Both sides wanted Korea to become independent, but they could not agree on what that Korea should look like. So how did one country become two competing governments? In 1948, the Republic of Korea was established in the south. Then, in September, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was established in the north. Its leader was Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla who had strong ties to the Soviet Union. Kim Il-sung was not satisfied with ruling only the northern half of Korea. He wanted the entire peninsula under his control. And in 1950, that ambition would turn the divided peninsula into a devastating war. June 25, 1950. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. The Korean War had begun. North Korean troops moved rapidly south, and Seoul fell within days. Millions of civilians suddenly found themselves caught between advancing armies. The United Nations responded, with American forces becoming the core of the international military effort. Then the direction of the war changed. UN forces pushed north, driving toward the Korean border with China. China entered the war, sending huge numbers of troops into Korea. The front moved south again. Then it moved north. Then south again. Imagine playing tug-of-war with an entire country in the middle. Cities were destroyed, villages were devastated, and millions of civilians were killed, wounded, or displaced. Families were separated, sometimes for decades. But neither side could completely defeat the other. In 1953, the fighting finally stopped with an armistice. But an armistice is not the same thing as a peace treaty. The border remained, and the Korean peninsula stayed divided. North Korea emerged from the war devastated, with cities, factories, roads, and homes badly damaged. And Kim Il-sung now had a destroyed country to rebuild and a perfect opportunity to concentrate power. So how did Kim Il-sung turn a devastated country into a state centered around one man? First, he began removing political rivals and concentrating power inside the ruling party. Opponents lost their positions, influence, and sometimes their freedom. The government became increasingly centralized, with Kim Il-sung at the center. Then came an idea that would become central to North Korean politics: Juche. Juche emphasized independence and self-reliance. But there was an obvious contradiction. North Korea depended heavily on support from both the Soviet Union and China. Imagine telling everyone you built the whole house yourself while secretly borrowing the bricks from your neighbors. Kim Il-sung's image also became increasingly important to the state. His portraits appeared across North Korean cities, schools, factories, and government buildings. He was presented not simply as a political leader, but as the father of the nation. And the government increasingly controlled what ordinary people could see, hear, and learn. Then came another powerful tool: political classification. North Korean society developed a system known as Songbun, which considered a person's family and political background. That background could affect education, employment, housing, and other opportunities. In other words, your family's history could follow you for years. And then something unusual happened. Political power began passing from father to son. North Korea was becoming not just a communist state, but a hereditary political dynasty, and its biggest crisis was still ahead. After Kim Il-sung, his son Kim Jong-il eventually inherited the country's leadership. The transition made one thing clear: political power in North Korea was becoming a family business. But while the leadership was becoming more secure, the economy was becoming more fragile. Then, in the 1990s, one of North Korea's most important economic lifelines disappeared. The Soviet Union collapsed. North Korea lost a major source of trade, energy, and economic support. Then severe floods and other disasters made the situation even worse. Food production fell, supplies became scarce, and the official distribution system began to break down. For ordinary families, getting enough food became a daily struggle. The exact number of people who died during the famine is still debated. But the disaster was enormous, and its effects changed North Korean society forever. When the official system stopped providing enough food, people had to find another way. They began trading clothes, food, household goods, and anything else they could sell. Informal markets started becoming increasingly important. Women often played a major role in these markets, buying and selling goods to support their families. Dramatized dialogue: "Where did you get that rice?" "I bought it." The government had wanted people to depend on the state, but the famine taught them to depend on themselves. The markets helped people survive, but they also created something the government could not completely control. And as North Koreans learned new ways to survive, the government faced a new question: how do you control a society that has learned to live without you? So how did North Korea survive after the famine and enter the modern world? Today, Kim Jong-un leads the country, continuing the political dynasty created by his grandfather. The government tightly controls television, radio, newspapers, and access to outside information. For ordinary citizens, the open internet available in most countries is heavily restricted. Even phones, computers, televisions, and radios can be subject to strict government controls. Movement is also restricted, and leaving the country without permission can bring severe punishment. North Korea also maintains systems of forced labor and political imprisonment. But here is the strange part: everyday life has not completely stopped. Markets now play an important role in how many ordinary people obtain food and other goods. People buy vegetables, rice, clothing, household products, and other necessities. Yet these markets exist under a government that still wants to control them. Meanwhile, North Korea has invested heavily in its military and weapons programs. The country has developed nuclear weapons and tested ballistic missiles. Its military power has become one of the main reasons the world continues watching North Korea closely. But ordinary people still face serious economic and food security challenges. And that brings us back to the beginning. How did ancient Korean kingdoms become a divided peninsula, and how did one temporary line create two completely different countries? For me, the strangest detail is that the 38th parallel was originally meant to be temporary, yet more than 70 years later, it still divides Korea. Which detail shocked you the most? And if you want to uncover another country shaped by an extraordinary history, click here for the next documentary.